Hi everyone, thank you for joining us today at Climate Conversations. I'm Sin from Art Science Museum in Singapore.
Hi everyone.
Across the last 3 months, we have been organizing this program of online talks unfolding alongside Planet of Plastic at Art Science Museum as a companion program of the exhibition. Climate Conversations dialogues with scientists and artists who are tackling complex environmental issues in their work to bring to you some of the most pressing, profound stories from the front lines of conservation and climate innovation. Planet of Plastic marks the first show to launch at Art Science Museum since we reopened after Singapore's circuit breaker. It tells the story of plastic from its invention just over a century ago to the environmental impact brought about by its mass consumption. Featuring 70 powerful images displayed in 6 thematic sections, the exhibition highlights the fragility of our natural environment and how it is impacted by the global plastic waste crisis. Each year, 9 million tons of plastic ends up in the ocean. If unretrieved, it is estimated that it will remain there for centuries, destroying the delicate ecosystems critical to not just our planet's health, but our survival. There is an ecosystem in every backyard and something that can be done anywhere. This is a problem we can fix, and it is exactly what Planet of Plastic is trying to address. The exhibition not only aims to raise awareness of society's dependence on plastic by visually depicting the crisis, it also highlights innovative individuals and communities who are working on solutions to this urgent problem. Since we launched Climate Conversations last October, we have heard from Cynthia Dumbier, Director of International Exhibitions at National Geographic Society, who spoke about how National Geographic's multi-year Planet of Plastic initiative harnesses storytelling to tackle the global plastic waste crisis and effect meaningful change. Dr. Intan Suci Nurhati, Senior Researcher at the Indonesian Institute of Sciences Research Centre for Oceanography, who highlighted issues in plastics management and shared her recent research work started in lockdown that looks at the rising tide of pandemic-driven plastic waste, as well as photographer Mandy Barker, who took us through the journey of how she has been working alongside marine scientists to transform data on ocean plastics into arresting collages of pollution. And today, in the penultimate talk in Climate Conversation series, we are so delighted to have with us renowned conservation scientist Lian Pin, who is director of the Centre for Nature-Based Climate Solutions at National University of Singapore and professor of conservation science, technology, and policy at the university's Department of Biological Sciences. Prof. Koh is a prominent researcher in the field of sustainability and environmental science, having worked in institutions across Switzerland, Australia, and the US over the last 16 years. His research focuses on developing policy-relevant science and science-based decision support tools to help reconcile humanity's needs with environmental protection. Prof. Koh is also the founding director of Conservation Drones, a non-profit organization that seeks to introduce drone technology to conservation scientists and practitioners worldwide. In his talk today, Prof. Koh will share about how a better understanding of the potential and limits of nature-based climate solutions is needed to help inform our climate policy and investment decisions. We are live streaming on both Facebook and YouTube and would love to hear from you throughout the session this afternoon. And we will be starting with the talk, then moving into the second part of the program where we will take questions from the floor. So please do share your thoughts and questions with us in the chat. It gives me great pleasure welcoming Professor Lian Pin to today's program.
Hi, Tin. Thanks very much for the kind introduction. I'm very happy to be here today, and I'm very grateful for this opportunity to speak at the Art Science Museum's Climate Conversation Seminar Series. So my name is Lian Pin. I am an applied ecologist and a professor, as Sin mentioned, at the National University of Singapore. I'm also the director of the relatively new Centre for Nature-Based Climate Solutions. So What are nature-based climate solutions? I think most of us have been hearing quite a bit about these things, right? Nature-based solutions. They are essentially just ways of leveraging the ability of natural ecosystems to sequester and store carbon through the process of photosynthesis to help us combat climate change. And therefore, nature-based solutions are very important for addressing climate change impacts. However, they are not without trade-offs and limitations. So in my talk today, I will discuss how having a better understanding of the promises and the challenges or pitfalls of nature-based solutions is important for informing our climate policies and decisions. I think many of us here might remember Secretary Rumsfeld making his infamous statement back in 2002. He was, of course, talking about a completely different context. But I think sometimes it's useful to think about a subject matter in terms of what we know and what we know we don't know. So I will break my presentation today into three main parts. The first is on what we know about climate change and nature-based solutions. The second is on what we are beginning to find out. And the third is on what we don't know yet, but urgently need to know. So let's start with what we know. I think we know the problem quite well. If we take the annual average temperature of our planet over the last 170 years or so, color code them on a temperature scale of blue to red, indicating cooler to warmer temperatures, this is what we would see. If we look at the data for individual countries in our region, we see a very similar trend. Today, it's not controversial anymore that our climate has been getting increasingly warmer at local, regional, and global levels. I think we also know the cause of the problem quite well. It's simply the accumulation of carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases in our atmosphere. So on this graph, the blue line shows global annual emissions. It is now close to about 40 billion tons per year. The pink line shows global carbon dioxide concentration. It is now over 400 parts per million. So we know the problem, we know the cause of the problem. I think we actually also know the solution. Well, we basically have to reverse what we had done in the past 170 years by reducing our emissions to effectively zero. And according to the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, we need to do that within the next 30 years or so if we are to achieve the Paris climate goal of limiting global warming to below 2 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels. In fact, we need to go below zero to also start to remove and reduce carbon dioxide concentration in our atmosphere. Now, the blue lines you see in this IPCC figure on the right indicate different pathways, global pathways for achieving the Paris target. Let's zoom in on pathway P3, which is one of the blue lines, and P3 represents a middle-of-the-road scenario. For the world to achieve net zero emissions by around mid-century, all IPCC pathways require emissions to peak in 2020 or 21, which is this year or last year, followed by a rapid decarbonization. But most importantly, all pathways also require actions in the brown part of the curve. And the brown part of the curve above the zero line represents opportunities to reduce emissions, mainly by avoiding further deforestation. For example, by protecting our remaining rainforests or forests that are under threat of loss. The brown part of the curve below the zero line are opportunities for us to remove emissions, mainly through the restoration of, for example, mangroves and other blue carbon ecosystems. So these so-called nature-based solutions, these are the so-called nature-based solutions. And scientists have estimated that these solutions have a combined global climate mitigation potential of up to about 24 billion tons of carbon dioxide per year. So nature-based climate solutions are important because they are an integral part of the solution. In other words, they are baked into every IPCC pathway for us to achieve the Paris climate goal. That also means that even if we manage to decarbonize, even if we manage to act on the gray part of the curve, we could still fall short of our targets unless we also figure out the science and the practice of implementing these nature-based solutions, the brown part of every pathway. Now let's move on to part 2. So what are we beginning to find out? This is another famous person you may recognize. Dr. Anthony Fauci famously said that numbers don't lie. He's right, of course, but maybe to add to that, we should acknowledge that numbers can and numbers do change over time as we improve our understanding of the world through science. So what I'm about to present to you are some preliminary research and findings from our center at NUS. And I emphasize that these are preliminary findings. Most of them are not yet published, and some may not be publishable until we have more data. But these initial insights may be helpful for us to understand what we should be focusing on and where some of the opportunities and risks might lie. So let's start with the issue of scale. What is the scale of our solution versus the scale of our problem? We know that global carbon emissions is around 40 billion tons per year. Here I've also included emissions of China, the United States, Indonesia, and Singapore for perspective. We also know that the mitigation potential of nature-based climate solutions in totality can be as high as about 24 billion tons per year. And within the universe of nature-based solutions, we know that the greatest potential lie in avoiding emissions by protecting our remaining natural ecosystems, protecting what we still have. So the first thing we did at the center was to quantify, to clarify the climate mitigation potential of protecting all remaining tropical forests, and especially tropical forests that are facing imminent threat of loss, and whereby an intervention could potentially avoid that loss. And these are what we call investable forest carbon. Now we find that the protection of these investable tropical forests could potentially generate carbon offsets amounting to about 2 billion tons per year. And these forests include terrestrial forests on mineral soil, peat swamp forests, and mangrove forests. And as you can see, this is quite a substantial amount of emissions reduction just by protecting what we've got left. And it may help countries and companies meet their emissions reduction goals, or potentially even be a source of tradable carbon credits or offsets. We then zoomed in on blue carbon, given the huge amount of interest on blue carbon, and ran the same analysis specifically for the protection of mangrove forests, mangrove blue carbon forests, using more refined data in terms of global climate mitigation. It provides about 0.03 billion tons of carbon offsets per year. However, blue carbon is still a very important solution for the many other co-benefits or benefits it delivers to society, especially at the national and subnational level, and for the hundreds and millions of people living in these coastal areas and whose lives and livelihoods depend on healthy coastal ecosystems. Now, because our analysis is spatially explicit, we are also able to produce a wall-to-wall map to show where this potential might lie. And we find that much of this potential would come from the Americas and Asia. The Americas could generate about 0.8 billion tons of investable carbon offsets per year. The number for Asia is slightly lower at about 0.6 billion tons. And in totality, the tropical region could generate about 1.8 billion tons of carbon offsets per year. At the country level, The top 5 countries with the largest investable carbon potential are Brazil, Indonesia, Bolivia, DRC, and Malaysia. And from a biodiversity conservation perspective, this map also tells us where forests are under threat and where we can invest to avoid the loss of both carbon and biodiversity by protecting those forests. However, it's important to also understand that not all investable carbon projects are profitable forest projects, carbon projects, because like any other economic activity, a carbon project's financial viability depends on a wide range of factors, including, for example, the price of carbon and the costs of establishing, maintaining, and operating that project. To help us understand the scale of the potential returns on investment from these forest carbon projects, we produced what is essentially a prospecting map. But in this case, instead of prospecting for precious metals or oil and gas, it is a map that could help investors prospect for carbon. And we find that the vast majority of financially viable and most profitable carbon sites are in fact located in Asia, in our part of the world, with a combined financial return of up to $25 billion per year in net present values. The forest carbon projects in Indonesia alone could generate up to about $10 billion per year in returns. So the potential returns of investing and implementing these forest protection projects may be quite substantial from a carbon finance perspective. However, and interestingly, these returns that are shown here are only from about 20% of all investable forest carbon sites. The vast majority of investable sites are actually not financially viable at carbon prices of around $5 to $6 per ton. And the non-financially viable sites are indicated by all the yellow parts on the map. And so from a biodiversity or forest conservation perspective, the map is also telling us, or the analysis is also telling us, that we need other policy interventions to protect all these unprofitable and yet threatened forests. Now, another important consideration is that the theoretical potential for climate mitigation can be quite different from what may be actually achievable on the ground. The difference between theory and practice, right? Because there will always be practical constraints that are specific to the local or regional contexts that need to be considered. So to talk about constraints, let me switch gears slightly and focus on reforestation as a climate solution. So in the past few slides, I have been talking about forest protection as a solution. Now I'll talk about reforestation. Recently, we also mapped the potential for reforestation in Southeast Asia, and we find that in our region, there are close to about 120 million hectares of degraded terrestrial forests, peat swamp forests, and mangroves that are biophysically suitable for reforestation. And the restoration of these degraded lands could potentially remove up to about 3.4 billion tons of CO2 per year. However, these so-called degraded lands may in fact be used by local communities as smallholder farmlands or home gardens, and the local communities might be growing these crops for their own subsistence, their own use, or for sale in local markets. And appropriating these lands for reforestation may compromise the livelihoods, the food security, and the land rights of these land users, regardless of land ownership. Right? And furthermore, reforestation may require constant site maintenance, right, and protection against threats. Some of these threats may include tree diebacks from diseases, illegal logging, and forest fires. So there is a cost to maintaining these reforestation projects. We find that as we start to apply these different layers of constraints, the picture starts to change very quickly as well. The amount of land that is actually practically available for reforestation can quickly shrink from what was thought to be about 120 million hectares to less than 8 million hectares across the region when we start to think about all these other factors. And in the most constrained scenario, reforestation would remove less than 0.25 billion tons of CO2 per year, which is literally a fraction of the unconstrained potential that we started with. Therefore, it is really important to develop better ways of quantifying, of mapping, and monitoring both the potential and constraints of nature-based solutions to better inform decisions and prioritize our investments to get the biggest bang for our buck. So why should we care about all these new knowledge and insights? I think these insights are important because they can tell us where there might be opportunities for countries in our part of the world or across any part of the tropics and the companies in those regions to reduce and or remove our emissions, or perhaps even invest in generating nature-based carbon credits to capitalize on new economic opportunities. But just as importantly, the science can also alert us to what some of the constraints and risks might be, constraints that are specific to our region or to a region. In fact, given that Singapore has such an intimate knowledge of the socio-economic, cultural, and geopolitical context of our region, I think it makes good sense for Singapore, for us, to invest in producing policy-relevant science in this area and serve as a knowledge hub for climate solutions for our region. So let's move on to part 3. Here I will run through a few slides to give you a flavor of some of the upcoming priority research that we are investing in this year and for the next few years. Now, nature-based solutions are important not just for climate change mitigation, but they are also hugely important for the many other ecosystem services and benefits that they deliver and provide to society, including biodiversity conservation, ensuring clean air and water, protecting our topsoil, safeguarding food security, protecting us against extreme weather events, and sustaining livelihoods, especially in rural areas. For example, a recent study estimated that mangroves provide flood protection benefits exceeding $65 billion per year at the global level. So our team is currently working on quantifying and mapping some of these co-benefits or other benefits of nature-based climate solutions in our region. Now, among the many co-benefits of nature-based solutions, biodiversity is particularly interesting and important because it is both a co-benefit and also a building block of healthy ecosystems. What do I mean by that? When we invest in protecting a forest, we protect its biodiversity. Conversely, a high diversity of animals, of plants, of microbes in the forest ensures that the forest continues to perform its ecosystem functions, not only to sustain itself, but also to deliver ecosystem services and benefits to humans, including the services of carbon sequestration and storage. And at the moment, this value of biodiversity is not properly reflected or captured or internalized in how we price carbon offsets or carbon credits. Because at the moment, 1 ton of carbon from a monoculture plantation, for example, forest plantation, can be priced the same as 1 ton of carbon from a highly diverse, pristine rainforest. But we know intuitively that carbon from the pristine forest is so much more valuable than carbon from the monoculture. So our team is also exploring ways to quantify this price premium of what we call this beautiful carbon from a pristine forest. So far, we have focused on green carbon, which are the terrestrial forests, and we also talked a bit about blue carbon, which are the mangroves and seagrass meadows. But there are, in fact, also several other kinds of high carbon ecosystems in the carbon rainbow that have received perhaps less attention, including a teal carbon. So teal is sort of a color between blue and green. And these teal carbon ecosystems include the freshwater swamp forests, like our Nisun swamp forest and peat swamp forests as well. And then there are the gold carbon systems or ecosystems, and these include the macroalgae or seaweeds. And more importantly, we need to understand the interconnectedness and the interdependence between these ecosystems to fully appreciate the climate change mitigation potential and co-benefits that these other high carbon ecosystems provide. So nature-based climate solutions are promising, as I have mentioned in the previous few slides, but they are certainly not without risks and uncertainties. And there are three big risks in particular. In terms of forest protection, it can be challenging to benchmark additionality, to understand what would have happened if not for this intervention. For example, if the threat of deforestation was inflated, then this investment would not deliver the full extent of its intended outcome. And alternatively, if the threat is real, say because the forest is sitting on very productive lands for agriculture, then the pressure to develop that forest land will always be there. And how do we ensure the permanence of the solution after the project has ended and the credits are retired? And finally, there is also the risk of development being diverted elsewhere. So in our highly globalized and telecoupled society, it can be quite challenging to mitigate or even to account for this risk of what we call leakage. Therefore, it is really important to develop better ways of accounting for these risks to inform decisions and prioritize our solutions. Okay, so far I've been talking quite a bit about what my team and I have been doing at our center in NUS. Now I will switch gears and talk about who we are. CNCS, or the Center for Nature-Based Climate Solutions, is a new research facility at NUS in Singapore. What we're trying to do with this center is to bring together researchers, professors, postdocs, students from across different disciplines, different departments, faculties, and even universities to pool our resources and expertise to work towards a common goal. The research interests and expertise of the center's researchers are very diverse. They include marine biology, mangrove ecology, forest ecology, as well as conservation science, remote sensing, spatial prioritization, and even environmental policy, governance, and law. The center invests in 5 key areas of strategic research. The first is to understand the impacts of climate change on Singapore's economy, on our environment, and on our society. And we are particularly interested in impacts that may be less understood and perhaps less obvious. And these include, for example, the impacts of climate change on food production and food productivity or crop productivity in our region, and how that may ultimately compromise or affect Singapore's food security. So these are the more indirect and also more insidious threats that Singapore could be facing because of climate change. The second area of focus is to understand the extent to which nature-based solutions can help reduce our emissions, remove carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases from the atmosphere, and increase our climate resilience. The third focus is to understand the economic, societal, policy, and political barriers to the uptake of nature-based solutions, and the ways by which we could potentially overcome these barriers. The fourth focus is to understand what solutions to prioritize or which solutions to prioritize where to invest and implement these solutions, and how to do it to get the biggest bang for our buck. And finally, technology is a cross-cutting theme at our center. We want to understand how we could use and leverage technology to improve the credibility, the integrity of our solutions, to reduce the costs of implementing these nature-based projects or solutions, and also to facilitate communications, education, and outreach around climate change issues and solutions, ultimately to raise the level of conversation in our society around those issues. To tackle those research questions, the center and our researchers use a wide range of research techniques. We collect empirical data through lab work, through field work, and also from remote sensing. And those data sets are critical for our analytical work to map, to monitor, and to inform the optimization and prioritization of our solutions. Now, obviously, we can't do any of this alone. We have been very proactively engaging with various stakeholders in Singapore and internationally as well. And these partners and potential partners come from different sectors, including academia, NGOs, government agencies, and corporates as well. Now, I've come to the end of the presentation, and this will be my last slide. And I just want to end by emphasizing the two main goals or missions of the center. The first goal for us is to produce policy-relevant science, to produce the knowledge base or the evidence base that could help inform climate strategies, decisions, and actions in Singapore and the region, particularly on nature-based solutions. The second and equally important goal for us is to empower leadership, leadership in our public and private sectors, but also in civil society, by building capacity for us to be able to respond appropriately and decisively to climate change challenges and new, perhaps new economic opportunities. And with that, I'd like to thank you for your attention, and I'll be happy to answer questions.
In just a moment, we will be going into a Q&A with Prof. Koh. So if you have any questions, comments, or thoughts, please continue to share them with us in the chat, whether you're joining us from Facebook or YouTube, and we will try to get to all of them. Thank you so much, Prof. Koh, for illuminating where some of the opportunities and considerations lie with nature-based climate solutions from the center's preliminary findings, and also giving us an overview of the center's efforts in working towards the goal of delivering them. Would you be able to share how nature-based solutions offer new ways to meet existing challenges compared to the more classical infrastructure-based solutions, or how they can be leveraged to achieve their full potential? We've got a similar question from Lin Song as well, who's asking, how do we model the complex feedbacks among ecosystems and climate systems?
Yeah, I think, so thanks for that question. It's a very important question. So it's this question of our options, right? Our range of solution sets between the more technology-focused solutions and what I've been talking about, the nature-based solutions. I think first of all and foremost, it is still critical to address the issue of decarbonization. That's something we absolutely cannot run away from. And as I had shown earlier in some of my slides, the IPCC pathways require us to act immediately to decarbonize. And that includes transitioning away from fossil fuels to renewables, includes increasing our energy efficiencies, and potentially also moving into some of the new technological solutions in terms of carbon capture, utilization, and storage. So ways to capture carbon dioxide as they are released from our use of fossil fuels. But in addition to all of that, and this is the point I was trying to make also in my earlier slides, in addition to all these technological solutions, we need also to focus on nature-based solutions. because, and this is the point that I think many people don't realize, quite a lot of our emissions over the few decades and century, a lot of our emissions have come not just from fossil fuel use, but also from land use change and forestry, agricultural activities, and that is a major contribution to carbon emissions as well. So part of one bucket of nature-based solutions is to stem the emissions, to stop or reduce further loss of further emissions from land use change and forestry. And so that's where we need to focus our attention on. And then in addition to that, nature-based solutions also includes another bucket which has to do with reforestation, essentially. So that's about being able to sequester, capture, and remove the legacy or historical carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases that we have already released into the atmosphere, capture them, lock them up in the biomass of our trees, of our vegetation, and also below ground.
Do you feel like there are any gaps in existing research that may hinder the propagation of nature-based solutions then?
Yes. There are lots of barriers and pain points to the uptake of nature-based solutions. And as I mentioned also earlier, that's one of the 5 key research areas, strategic areas that we are focusing on. For example, at the moment, when we're talking about nature-based carbon offsets that is being traded or being traded in the markets today, it's a mixed bag in terms of quality. There are, of course, the carbon projects, forest carbon projects that are done very well, of high quality, but there are also those that are very shady, and we don't really know if the projects are delivering on their promises. So one of the immediate and urgent knowledge gaps or science gaps is to come up with ways to increase the credibility and integrity and the transparency of how these forest carbon projects are being implemented, are being validated, verified, and monitored over the lifetime of the project period. And we believe there are many opportunities to leverage technology to help us do that. For example, through spaceborne remote sensing, and coupled with machine learning techniques that could very cost effectively enable us to do that.
We've got quite a lot of questions coming in when you were doing your presentation just now, Prof. Koh. So on a very similar note, a question from Tom Spencer Smith, who's asking, how about reforestation, turning unused land, deserts into forests or carbon sinks? Is this viable?
Yeah, I mean, the classic answer of an ecologist or a biologist is it depends. It always depends, right? It's context dependent. So in some areas, it would be a no-brainer for us to reforest, to grow new forests on barren land or degraded lands, capturing the atmospheric CO2 that way, and locking them up in the vegetation. But in other areas, particularly in areas that are perhaps undergoing rapid development, countries or landscapes undergoing rapid development, there will usually be other competing priorities of society, competing users of the land, and therefore there will be opportunity costs. If we use this land to grow new forests, then we wouldn't be able to use the same piece of land for something else, to build new HDB flats or whatever housing, to build a new hotel, to build other facilities, which are potentially also equally important for society, other segments of society. So another thing that science could help to address is to be able to capture all these different competing priorities of society, and using a very evidence-based, science-based approach to clarify, to quantify the trade-offs, the opportunity costs, and come up with different scenarios of development that could potentially prioritize different outcomes. And then those science-based products or information would be very useful to help inform decisions, policy decisions, and investment decisions.
We've got a question from Andrew Kam, who's asking about your slides about how keeping forests can help offset emissions. He's asking whether you feel petitions are helpful, or is there actually a better way to gain traction?
Petition to conserve forests. Okay. That's interesting. I think again it depends. It depends on the local context. I think, okay, speaking on perhaps on the Singapore context, I think what we can do as researchers, as scientists, and even as civil society, is to gather the evidence base, right? To come up with the facts and figures, not just qualitatively, not just saying how many, what this forest is good for, how many different benefits it's delivering, but actual numbers, and be able to quantify these benefits, preferably in currencies that are translatable or understandable by the other pressures that are being faced by this land or this forest. In other words, financial terms. Then we would be able to, I think, more convincingly argue our case to protect a forest or to use barren land for reforestation.
Yeah, I wanted to take the opportunity to also ask you, when you spoke about the sort of competing priorities in society, there seems to be this continuing imbalance in investment in nature-based solutions. And according to research, these efforts are mostly underfunded and under-prioritized, underrepresented in climate action plans in some countries more than others. And despite new sort of corporate climate commitments that are being made every day, why do you feel this is the case? And can we say whether the onus falls more with the private sector or the public sector?
Yeah, so one of the key reasons or main reasons why nature-based climate solutions may have received much less attention than some of the other climate solutions, like solar power or hydropower or wind power, is because because nature-based solutions involves the land, it involves people, it involves people's lives and livelihoods. So it's very complex, very complicated, and so that's one issue. We have to somehow be able to, first of all, account for all these other competing users of the forest or the land, and secondly, understand and find ways to reconcile them, right, based on each society's priorities. And secondly, as I mentioned earlier, at the moment, nature-based carbon offsets is a mixed bag, and there are good ones and bad ones. It's it's hard for investors or policymakers to discern and make a judgment call on whether to go full on into nature-based solutions as a viable solution set. And that's also why investing in the science and the technology to help improve the credibility of nature-based solutions is very important and very urgently needed.
And Tian Wu is asking whether there might be any downsides to labeling threatened nature spaces as profitable or non-profitable. Will it encourage even more development? And considering that market mechanisms are subject to so much change, is this necessarily a good way to protect nature spaces in the region?
Well, if we want to have a transparent conversation with the decision makers, I think personally, I think it's always good to be upfront about the current values or the current ways we are valuing a piece of land. Be it the amount of carbon credits that could be generated and traded in markets, or other values. And we also need to be transparent about the constraints or the limitations in terms of what we cannot financially value at the moment. For example, on the biodiversity, obviously, intuitively to many of us, it's hugely important. The value of forests to our physical and mental well-being is hugely important. At the moment, we may not have the tools to be able to put a dollar value to these important benefits that the forest is delivering and providing to us. And so it's again, all the more important for us to invest in the science, invest in developing new ways of quantifying these values. Now, if we lose these forests, how would that impact the mental health and the physical health of the communities around the forest in terms of, for example, I don't know, increased visits to health providers or whatever. I don't have the answers at the moment, but suffice to say, it's really important to invest in quantifying all these values and trying to internalize them so that we can help inform decisions.
There's a comment from Samantha Sia. So Samantha's mentioned that economics has inaccurately valued natural resources, and she's asking, does it remain valid to look at climate change mitigation in the context of economics, given that a majority of economic growth has been based on exploitation of natural resources? Does it make sense to consider other capitalism independent based solutions as well? Example, degrowth.
Yes, I think given the urgency and the magnitude and seriousness of the challenge we are facing, we need to consider all kinds of solutions. In fact, in a few of my earlier slides, I did mention the fact that when we did the financial analysis on investable forest carbon sites across the tropics, we found that the vast majority of those sites are actually not profitable. So if an investor invests in them today, they would not be able to break even over the 20, 30-year project lifetime of the project period. So that means for it at current market prices, the vast majority of forest projects of investable forest sites around the world, very valuable for carbon and also under threat. Vast majority of them would require other forms of intervention for them to be conserved. And these would possibly include policy interventions that would be independent of carbon markets. And that's where perhaps the civil society would be playing a huge and important role, together with the researchers and research institutions to provide the arguments and the case for why these forests are immensely valuable for whatever benefits they are providing, and why they should be and how they should be protected.
And there's a question from Siddharth Sachdeva as well, who's asking what constraints would decrease the restorable land by the biggest margin?
There are a couple of constraints. I think the biggest one possibly is opportunity cost. Right? Again, it comes back to finances. If we use this piece of land to grow a new forest, we wouldn't be able to use it to grow something else, to grow crops, and hence we would be sacrificing that the future agriculture rent or the revenues that could be generated from using the land for other crops. So that's one big constraint. But there are other constraints such as the availability of manpower or a labor force to manage and maintain the reforestation site. And that would potentially be a function or related to how far away that reforestation site is from an urban center, from a city, and therefore very very ulu or very isolated reforestation sites may not be viable for reforestation as well. And then there's also the issue of proper use or seed sources, where can we source for the native species, tree species, to reforest the site. And if there are already no reservoir, no big patches of forest nearby, then that could also be another problem and another constraint to the success of that reforestation site.
So going back to your slides, Stuart Smith is asking, are the forest protection and carbon storage potential estimates for above ground or plant carbon storage? Do any of these estimates also consider soil carbon?
Well, yes and no. For some of these projects, the main empirical data, the data that is collected and accounted for is usually above ground carbon. So the amount of carbon that is stored in the vegetation biomass, tree, in the trunks, and the branches and leaves. And usually what happens, and this is mainly because we have so little information on what's happening underground. We don't even know for sure in many ecosystems how deep is the carbon stocks, soil carbon stock underground. So we usually use a heuristic where we just conveniently assume that there's a certain ratio of above ground to below ground carbon storage in a particular ecosystem, and come up with estimates that way. So to answer your question, the more confident measurements and data would be coming from above ground carbon, and the below ground carbon, especially soil carbon, are usually very rough estimates.
Just pulling the focus back to the local ecology, we've got a question from Daryl Chu, who's asking, following up on your answer about preserving forests, what is your position on whether the Dover and Clementi forests should be conserved?
So maybe what I should say is that this will be soon discussed in the public over the next week. So I would prefer not to preempt those discussions. So personally, I would just reiterate what I said earlier. I think in many societies, including our society, there are always conflicting priorities, competing priorities, and sometimes good cases can be made to put more emphasis in one priority over another. Personally, of course, being an ecologist and a conservation scientist, I would definitely hope to see that whatever precious pockets of forest that we have left in Singapore can be preserved, for not just for the carbon benefits, but also for biodiversity, for human, for our physical and mental well-being, for our enjoyment, and so on. But we also need to understand what the other considerations are, and I think we should ask good questions to understand how those different priorities are factored in the ultimate decision to whether to conserve or not to conserve some of these remaining forest patches.
Daniel Uy is also asking whether you might be aware of any plans to expand our mangrove forests as a solution for carbon offsets, considering our ideal climate.
Yeah, I think there are several discussions going on to potentially rehabilitate some of our degraded mangrove sites. Personally, I think the actual delta or the contribution that would make to global climate mitigation might be quite small, just because Singapore we don't have much land left, with even coastal areas left. But it's still very important for various reasons, right? Again, coming back to the other priorities of society, right? Rehabilitating mangrove forests could be important for humans, for biodiversity, and so on. And also, importantly, from a research and science perspective, we may also learn quite a lot from rehabilitating these mangrove forests in Singapore. We could use them as pilot sites to understand how to do it properly, what species to use, what technology, what methods to use to monitor their progress and so on. And then some of these insights, the science and the technology that we would develop from running these pilot sites in Singapore could then potentially be scaled up and implemented and used for mangrove restoration projects around the region, if not across the tropics. So in that sense, Singapore could be a very important test bed for mangrove restoration.
Well, Carmine Pang is interested to know whether it's possible to quantify the benefits of reconnecting Singapore's forest fragments through man-made structures such as eco-tunnels and eco-bridges with a goal to increase biodiversity.
Yeah, I think definitely it definitely is possible to quantify. I believe, although don't quote me on this, I believe and NParks. This is a public seminar. I believe NParks probably has already done that. If not, then there are opportunities for students to come and work with us to do some work on that, to quantify exactly as you mentioned, how by joining up and linking up different patches of forest, or even maybe creating new patches of forest as stepping stones, right? So that some of the wildlife could hop from one patch to another, for them to travel between, for example, two bigger patches of forest, using stepping stones to connect the two. So all these are interesting research questions and are valuable research questions that could be tackled.
Ashley Xiao is also interested to find out, with Singapore pushing to have 30% of our agricultural needs settled locally by 2030, how can the agriculture industry participate in nature-based climate solutions or vice versa?
Okay, that's a very good point. In fact, that goes to my point earlier about competing priorities, right? So if we keep a forest or grow a new forest somewhere inland, scarce Singapore, then potentially we wouldn't be able to use that forest towards our 30 by 30 goal, right? But I think in terms of, okay, just putting that aside, in terms of agriculture, there are also ways to either reduce or remove emissions, right? So improving agriculture practices or forestry practices is another bucket of nature-based solutions. Perhaps not in the Singapore context, but in other countries where there are huge fields of agricultural fields, then by changing some of the practices, for example, by practicing no-till agriculture, we may be able to reduce the emissions, the loss of carbon from tillage, and by allowing the fallow lands to just weeds to grow in the fallow lands, then those weeds could also sequester carbon. So things like that, they are also considered nature-based solutions. And in Singapore's context, coming back to Singapore's context, some of the high-tech agriculture practices, I think there are also ways to incorporate the principles of nature-based solutions to reduce emissions or even to sequester emissions. Perhaps in terms of some of the equipment or the raw materials or the feedstock that has been used, or chemicals that are being used for these high-tech agriculture systems. Yeah.
Well, we understand that the Centre for Nature-Based Climate Solutions at NUS has been a focal point for research and thought leadership on nature-based solutions for climate mitigation and adaptation in Asia Pacific. And as part of the Centre's work, people are also really interested to find out whether the Centre might have any plans in terms of communicating the importance of climate solutions to the broader non-academic community. So I have a couple of questions here, which I'll bundle up and I'll ask you, Prof. Koh. Wan Ching Lim is asking whether your team have any local fieldwork projects happening in Singapore. And if not, where are most of your research focused at? And then a related question from Hazlina as well. Are there any opportunities for primary school students to partner or support the Centre in the work that you do?
Yeah, definitely. So this center, when we set it up, we deliberately want it to be a very public facing, a very public engaging research center, perhaps a little bit unlike some of the more traditional research facilities. So we are very proactively engaging with many public facing organizations, including what we are doing today, right, with the Art Science Museum. We are also engaging with, for example, Gardens by the Bay, Sentosa, and then some of the other organizations to work with them to find ways to bring our science in a very easily digestible form to the public, to educate the public on what nature-based solutions are, why they are important, and also to educate them on some of the issues that are brought up today, right? This idea that there might be many different competing priorities in society, how we need to consider the trade-offs, the costs, how do we reconcile all these different issues, and how do we make difficult decisions or support difficult decisions and so on. And in terms of fieldwork opportunities, some of our researchers are actively doing fieldwork in Singapore, in the reefs, in the marine areas, in mangrove forests, in peat swamp forests. Sorry, not peat swamp, freshwater swamp forests. So if anyone is interested, either on an individual basis or interested in bringing your students, perhaps you are pre-tertiary school teachers, do feel free to contact us, and we will explore opportunities to do that together.
That's so lovely to hear. We've got so many questions coming through today's session, and while we might not be able to address all of them, I was just wondering whether we could end on this last note, Prof. Koh. What advice can you pass on to students, researchers, and young investigators who are obviously listening today and are looking to make a career in science?
Oh, stick with it. I think that's the in a nutshell advice I can give. It's a very difficult, it's not an easy career, I would say, but most careers are not easy, I guess. But it can be very rewarding, very fulfilling, and you would be making a big difference and important impact to society, especially if you focus on how you can inform decisions that would affect the different priorities of Singapore or whichever society that you belong to.
Thank you so much for making time to take part in Climate Conversations, Prof. Koh, and bringing about what has been a very pertinent talk and discussion to today's program. And we're all very excited to see how the work at the Centre will continue to evolve. And we wish you and the very wonderful team at the Centre our very best. Also, a huge thank you to all of you who have been listening in to Climate Conversations this afternoon as well. We very much appreciate all the questions and comments that you have shared with us during the session today. And we would also love to receive your feedback on the program, which you can share with us through an online survey by scanning the QR code that will be coming onto the top right corner of your screen. So in the concluding talk in Climate Conversation series live streaming on the 10th of March at 8 p.m., we will be joined by ecologist and president of Nature Society Singapore, Sean Lam. Nature Society is a volunteer-led NGO that's dedicated to the appreciation, conservation, study, and enjoyment of the unique natural heritage in Singapore, Malaysia, and the surrounding region. And Dr. Lam's leadership of the society since 2008 has been associated with many wonderful conservation and outreach initiatives that aim to make nature part of the Singaporean identity. So Dr. Lam will share about the efforts by Nature Society Singapore focused on marine conservation and coastal cleanup, and how we can play a role in protecting our marine environments and biodiversity. On the 5th of March as well, my colleague Amita Kripalani is leading a curator's tour of Planet of Plastic exhibition in the galleries, and she'll be taking visitors on a visual journey through profound and inspiring images, videos and infographics that tell the story of the global crisis of marine plastics as seen through the lenses of National Geographic's photographers and explorers. So please join us for the on-site curators tour and our concluding climate conversations online talk with Dr. Sean Lam if you're able to. You can also stay up to date with everything that's happening on site at the museum and on our online content platform, Art Science at Home, via our website, Facebook page, and YouTube channel. And we do hope you get a chance to visit Planet of Plastic at Art Science Museum between now and March. Please continue to stay safe and keep well in the meantime, and we hope to see you all soon. And thank you so much, Prof. Koh, once again.
Thank you.